Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life is but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Let's do a little flash forward. It's 2037. You and your partner have just finalized that nasty-ass divorce. And to break the news to the kids, you're taking them to Applebee's. But not before a family trip to the movies. That's right, you're taking the kids to see the live-action remake of Chicken Little. Yup, that's right, apparently Chicken Little is next in line to get a live-action remake. Now, the ex-wife and kids are having a good time, but you, the animator in you, is hurt. Not only is this the 53rd live-action remake, but you haven't noticed any new films either. Pixar's the only one still doing it, and even then, they're slowing down. Nobody's hiring animators anymore. ChatGPT is writing all the scripts, and dead voice actors are brought back with AI, and no one can tell if a human made it because they're either overworked to death or out of a job. The sky really is falling. You then get kicked out of the theater. If you couldn't tell by now, animation is something that I truly hold near and dear to my heart. I've always had a deep passion for it, from drawing as a child and watching it on screen all the way to adulthood creating it. Regardless of if it's traditional 3D, claymation, stop motion, animation has always been an art form that can capture just about anything the imagination can produce. If you can imagine it, best believe it can be articulated through animation. Now, animation, like television and film and the rest of Hollywood, are all forms of entertainment. And like any form of entertainment, as long as there can be money made from it, best believe there's an industry built around it ready to exploit it. Hollywood, by default, is a capitalist entity. It's a system and network of multi-billion-dollar corporations that fund and produce films for the sole sake of making money. To the shareholders that run these companies, the money is always going to come first. The art is just secondary. Because it's all about the money, Hollywood will always opt to take the safe route. After all, taking too big of a risk and making something that confuses or offends the audience could potentially risk losing money. It's the reason why we're on our 19th Jurassic Park movie. Jurassic World, my bad. Whatever it's called now. At the end of the day, profit will always be the primary motivator of Hollywood, and all of the big shots that run it will do whatever it takes to keep that profit rolling in. This leaves you, the artist, in a rather nasty position. The craft that you've dedicated your life to becomes more and more commodified with each passing day. In order for the entertainment industry to function, it requires that these companies constantly exploit your labor in order to keep up with their profit margins. At any given moment, a studio or company can terminate your entire career just to save a few dollars. Your worth as an artist becomes nothing more than a dollar sign. The fantasies you once had regarding Hollywood are all dead, as you now see the entertainment industry for the mess that it really is. In your eyes, Hollywood itself is as good as dead. Well, not to everyone, that is.
Lights have dimmed in Hollywood tonight with actors walking the picket line instead of the red carpet. The entire industry is shut down with actors and writers on strike together for the first time in more than 60 years.
Strike through. The Writers Guild of America could soon end the second longest strike in the union's history.
Now let's see who this job creep really is.
No surprise, it was corporate greed all along.
The level of expectation that they have that is just not realistic.
Look, somebody better go check on the Hollywood sign, because the lights might be on, but nobody's home. Hollywood, that includes animation, film, and television, as we know it in its current form, is dying. This slow death has been a decades-long process that's only recently been accelerated within the past decade. However, not for the reasons that are often being proclaimed. When examining the decline in Hollywood, emphasis is often put on cultural elements, not realizing how these elements are used by corporations to their advantage. These corporate entities, from Disney to Amazon all the way to Warner Brothers, have carefully crafted a cheat code. A method that has successfully allowed them to use public outrage and weaponized nostalgia to distract the public from their sinister, greedy, and exploitative business practices that are slowly killing Hollywood. The scary part is, unless we recognize the real villains behind the screen, it's only going to end up with artists dead, without a livelihood, or both. So let's unpack this decades-long debacle and finally discover who and what is behind the death of Hollywood.
What am I doing?
As usual, before we get started, let's establish a few things so that we're all on the same page. When I say the death of Hollywood or Hollywood is dying, I don't mean a total collapse of cinema or that Hollywood is going to stop making movies. That's realistically never going to happen. What I'm referring to is the predatory business practices that have been slowly killing the workforce within the industry, and the direct correlation that plays in regards to the decline in quality. The working conditions, the wages, the demand from the studios, the corruption, the greed, all of these factors are making it harder for the people who give us these productions to survive, diminishing both the quality of their lives as well as the art they produce. The labor force that keeps the machine running is essentially being drained, while the studios and executives up top keep all of the profits. I've noticed that often when trying to examine the factors that lead to the decline in Hollywood's quality, emphasis is often put on cultural elements such as identity politics and nostalgia bait, without realizing that those cultural elements all share the same root, that root being Hollywood's tendency to exploit them both for profit, without paying much respect, attention, or care to the cultural elements themselves. While a lot of responses to this recognize Hollywood's tendency to do this, they tend to not ask why that is. Why is it that Hollywood likes to pretend to uplift marginalized communities when all of their political affiliations and donations say otherwise? Why is it that many of the public responses to these predatory practices tend to punch down at the communities themselves instead of upwards towards the corporations? And most importantly, how does Hollywood continue to insulate itself despite knowing some of these tactics are unpopular amongst its audience that consume it? Well, to explore this, we're gonna have to dig deep into Hollywood's powerhouse of a profit model. How have these studios managed to get away with self-sabotaging themselves for so long and still make ridiculous amounts of money? Well, let's find out.
Here we show you a close-up of a frog croaking.
While the phrase Hollywood is dying has picked up steam these past few years, it's nothing new. In fact, if you pay attention to the reasons why it's often said, you can see that at its base, it's people noticing greedy and cheap trends that have been plaguing the industry for decades, and in turn causing the quality to drop. In other words, Hollywood's been quote-unquote dying for at least a few decades now. Hollywood's got one main job, and that job is to sell its audience entertainment. Their money hinges on this. If what they're producing isn't entertaining to the audience, then they won't watch it, and the studios in turn won't make money. Normally, this isn't hard to do. When you've already got some massive IPs under your belt, all you have to do is release blockbusters on a regular schedule. Streaming and merchandise will take care of the rest. Even with multiple different audiences and demographics, it's still possible to craft content that's inclusive, entertaining to everyone, and still extremely profitable. Well, then what's the problem? We all know the classic phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, there's another classic phrase that everyone likes to forget. If it ain't broke, then squeeze every possible penny you can out of it. Believe it or not, this shit makes a lot of money, even the bad ones. Within the span of not even half a decade, massive franchises such as Marvel, Star Wars, and Fast and Furious had raked in box office revenue of over $15 billion collectively. Combine this with massive worldwide fandoms and cultural influence, companies saw how they could release just about anything and still turn out a profit. However, there's an issue with this. There's only so many pennies you can squeeze before the piggy runs dry. To keep up with this massive profit, you're gonna have to keep cranking out media at a massive rate. This is a problem as it not only risks diluting the brand, but also giving your audience fatigue. On top of that, it requires these companies to push their artists harder to pump out more and more products, resulting in them being both underpaid and overworked, the latter of which is not good for public image. Your greed has essentially left you on a sinking ship, left with the problem of oversaturation and bad optics. But for the studios at Hollywood, there is a way off. A strategy and profit model that allows them to maximize profits while keeping the heat off of them. For the sake of semantics, let's call it the cheat code. The cheat code ensures that even though the ship is sinking, you as a Hollywood studio are still guaranteed to make money. Essentially, if you keep people entertained enough by constantly pumping out content, then they won't focus on all of the predatory practices and will forget about all of the horrible stuff. But let's actually break that down. It does so through two ways: insulating profit and distracting the public. First things first, insulating profit. Making sure that no matter how bad things get, they're not bleeding too much money. The last thing these studios want is a box office bomb, pouring millions into a project just for it to barely break even. To combat this, you play it safe. Rather than spending and investing too much money on a new project that's not guaranteed to break even, you recycle content that's already made billions. Instead of emphasizing innovation, the goal is to highlight nostalgia. Old franchises start getting rebooted for the sake of trying to appeal to nostalgia. The works of past writers and directors end up moshed into interconnected universes. Standalone films with a complete story end up with unnecessary sequels, prequels, and spin-offs. The end result is a recycled, oversaturated mess where content gets released solely based on metrics and data rather than creative passion. The magic of what made it special is now diluted as projects are now getting released for the sake of trying to maintain momentum. And we as an audience never ask how much of it is necessary. I mean, how much do we really need? Do we really need a new live-action Star Wars project every year? Do we really need 3 to 4 MCU projects every year? Do we really need yet another big multiverse movie? Another live-action remake of an animated film? How long do you think it is until we get a live-action Treasure Planet? These cheap and lazy practices, as much as they dilute and damage the quality of the brand, they still make money. They still end up being box office successes for the most part. Therefore, in Hollywood's eyes, it's seen as a win. You have a profit model that allows you to still make money regardless of whatever rehashed slop it is that you put out. By the time the ship has already sank, you'll be on a lifeboat with all the profit. But insulating profit is only one part of the cheat code. It also serves to distract the public. The audience isn't blind to the aforementioned lazy practices. They can clearly tell when the studio's greed is affecting the quality of art, and they're going to push back. But as a studio, if you can redirect the pushback onto something or someone else, then there's no need to worry about the bulk of the criticism making it back to you. And a large way studios are able to get away with this is by allowing the blame to be shifted on cultural elements. It's how we start getting identity politics and quote-unquote wokeness blamed for the current state of things. When I originally started writing this, I wanted to avoid really engaging in any anti-woke nonsense because 90% of it is just rage bait. But then I realized how much of this ridiculous narrative plays into everything. How it essentially ends up being a perfect distraction for Hollywood. I'm gonna say it now, and you can pause and yell at me through the screen all you want. Hollywood is not woke. There is nothing about the definition of woke that even remotely applies to Hollywood as an institution. The original and true definition, the definition that's been used and accepted for over 70 years before conservatives recently started to change it, has meant to be aware and attentive of the social climate and societal injustices around you, specifically that of racial inequity. Its origins trace as far back as the 1930s, with singers like Lead Belly all the way to writers and activists like William Melvin Kelly and Marcus Garvey using it. Each one of them using it within the context of staying vigilant to the racism of society. Today, it's used more as a tongue-in-cheek stand-in for anything that's progressive. This may or may not include black people, women, LGBTQ, disabled, or any identity you can think of. If it's progressive and you don't like it, just call it woke. With the definition in mind, you have to ask yourself, when was Hollywood woke? Taking a look at its 100-year-plus track record, it never has been. If to be woke is to be vigilant or at least aware of the racial and social injustices around you, then Hollywood is not and never will be vigilant of those things, because Hollywood is a part of that same system that perpetuates it. As stated before, Hollywood is a machine, an $808 billion machine that is composed of more than just studios, but distributors, telecommunications giants, media and entertainment firms, financial institutions, all pouring their resources into one pot with the hopes of generating more profit in return. They've proven time and time again that they are more than willing to accept and turn a blind eye to social inequities so long as it doesn't interfere with their profits. Hell, Disney didn't have a problem with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' Don't Say Gay bill until it risked costing their theme parks money. After the matter was resolved, Disney went right back to making donations to Republican causes. From their donations, political leanings, all the way to the executives that run it up top. They all are conservative. To put it plainly, Hollywood is not woke and never will be woke. But let's entertain the false definition for a minute, that wokeness is the result of forced progressive politics. If that's the case, it's always been quote-unquote forced within Hollywood. The only difference is you don't notice them when the project is good. It's like when certain Star Wars fans complain about the franchise being too political nowadays, and then in the next sentence state that their favorite trilogy is the prequels, as if the prequel trilogy isn't the most political out of the three. It only becomes too political when the project either isn't executed well or you miss them altogether. And that's the key phrase, executed well. Let's face it, some films are just badly written, and that quality of writing plays a huge role in how well a theme, political or otherwise, is gonna be conveyed. But to these anti-woke arguments, the writing is bad because Hollywood spent too much time trying to figure out how to fit women and minorities into the project, not because the project just has bad writing. When the writing is good, it becomes one of your favorite things, but when the writing is bad, all of a sudden it speaks to a larger agenda behind the scenes. But underneath all the nonsense, the anti-woke crowd is ironically right about one thing. Hollywood doesn't actually care about these marginalized communities. But you don't have to be some mastermind to figure that out. We've known for years that Hollywood values optics rather than real progress and equity. The problem is, the anti-woke crowd for the most part can never make it past the first page. They think the problem is quote-unquote forced diversity rather than the underlying issue of greed and exploitation. They think they figured out Hollywood's grand agenda without realizing they're playing right into it. What we all see is part of the distraction, the progressive facade that these companies like to put on in order to keep the heat off their back, as well as to appear supportive of marginalized groups. But the reality is, they never will care about us until it comes down to protecting their pockets. We've seen it throughout Hollywood's history, from white actors and racial makeup all the way to the blacklisting of actors in the 50s. For decades, Hollywood was scared to even let black people star in leading roles, which didn't become a norm until the early 70s. We've seen the marketing campaigns and the globalized anti-blackness and queerphobia that these companies have perpetuated overseas, the willingness to screw over and throw marginalized creators under the bus but promote us on screen when it's time to rake in dollars. However, Hollywood's performative support of marginalized groups is not synonymous with quote-unquote forced diversity. We can acknowledge the fact that these corporations don't actually care about us without coming to the conclusion that the mere presence of us on screen is the result of some diversity quota. But if you get enough of the public to believe that the inclusion of these groups are the reason why stories are bad, or that our very presence is the result of a DEI initiative, then no one will focus on the predatory business practices behind the screen. Identity politics become the perfect scapegoat. Every single one of us ends up playing into the distraction at the end of the day. Everyone is either too busy arguing about the wokeness or busy trying to argue with the anti-woke crowd themselves. At the end of the day, the cheat code works and Hollywood as a system still ends up winning every time. They've eliminated the need to create anything new by coasting off of nostalgia and past box office successes, while at the same time keeping the public distracted enough to not hurt their box office and streaming numbers too much. The studio executives who run the show were already on the lifeboats by the time we realized the ship was sinking. But who exactly is on those lifeboats? Who's pulling the strings? Who controls the magical wizard behind the curtain? How bad are the working conditions behind the scenes? In this next section, we're going to explore the top players at Hollywood. Not just who some of them are, but how much wealth they've managed to exploit. And what economic impact does this have on us, the consumer? Well, let's just say they're not really laughing to the bank. They've got the keys to the vault.
Sir, we've lost our bridge deflector shield. Intensify the forward batteries. I don't want anything to get through. Intensify forward power!
Yes, finally, we can remove the curtain and finally discover the diabolical men and women who run this whole thing. Well, that's anticlimactic. I was kind of expecting some grinning suit with glowing red eyes. To put it plainly, there's no singular wizard or group of wizards running the show behind the curtain. Instead, it's a system of corporate entities, all with different sizes and degrees of interconnectivity. If we take a look at ownership within Hollywood, we can see that the vast majority of power is held by 5 major corporations: Universal, Walt Disney, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and Sony. The extent of how much power these companies have cannot be underestimated, as all mainstream distribution, both film and television, goes through them in one way or another, either serving as a parent company for other studios and distributors, or consolidating them through mergers and acquisitions. In the end, around 80 to 85% of film production and distribution is held by this small handful of companies with vast and limitless resources. But who owns those 5? Well, that's when things get a little more complicated. The studios themselves are all a part of much larger conglomerates, and those conglomerates themselves don't fall down to singular ownership. There's institutional shareholders, hedge funds, banks, telecommunications giants, each with their own respective stakes in the company. Those institutions themselves are owned by other institutions and entities, oftentimes simultaneously owning each other along with separate companies. You end up with this big web of money. Trying to trace back sole or majority ownership for these companies is impossible, as, in a way, they all own each other. At the end of the day, they all answer to money, whether it be the projects they're funding or the ones funding them. One of the reasons I say this is because too often we choose one of our favorite CEOs that everyone loves to hate, not realizing that at the end of the day, they are just one small piece of the puzzle. All of the greedy, shady, and exploitative practice that they co-sign are done so in accordance with those who line their pockets. They directly answer to institutional shareholders and investors and form many, if not most of their decisions based on what their metrics are telling them. Recognizing this in no way absolves any of them, but it does highlight just how deep the rabbit hole goes. And trying to pin sole responsibility on these CEOs only serves as a scapegoat while the rest of the perpetrators get off scot-free. These major studios are not some shadowy cabal pulling the strings. It's a hydra. Getting rid of Bob Iger or David Zaslav or Ryan Robbins or whoever it is that everyone loves to hate isn't going to begin to solve the problem. The company will just regrow 2 new heads in their place. When your enterprise is part of a much larger web, it becomes much more difficult for it to fail because of one person, if not impossible. But there's a huge advantage that comes with this. That interconnectivity gives them a lot of leeway with how much they can get away with. When every company is essentially owned by each other, they can engage in shady practices without too much heat on them, as every other company like them is doing the exact same thing. Price gouging, wage theft, tax evasion, poor working conditions. When everyone else is doing it, there's no real way for the public to hold them accountable other than to call them out for it. And the last time we checked, that doesn't do too much in terms of accountability. But we've always known how evil these corporations are and how they do anything under the sun just to continue to make money. Why is it now that we're feeling the effects harder than ever before? Well, the pandemic. Yeah, YouTube still doesn't like that word being said. The pandemic was the perfect opportunity for these studios, as it allowed them to exploit and acclimate as much wealth as possible, while simultaneously establishing almost complete control over the industry. The pandemic essentially shut down Hollywood for months. Dozens, if not hundreds of projects were halted, delayed, or scrapped altogether. Completed films either couldn't release or had to end their theatrical runs prematurely. And this sudden shift dealt such a massive financial blow to Hollywood that it was reported that losses had reached up to $20 billion by summer 2020. Hollywood was essentially put in an impossible position. Most of these studios relied on these massive franchises and IPs. They couldn't afford to just halt production altogether. In order to recover these losses, Hollywood quickly had to shift towards the digital space, embracing streaming. But the switch to streaming ended up doing more than just being a recovery method for the studios. They used the opportunity to cut costs and maximize profits as much as possible. What this looked like to the workforce within Hollywood was mass layoffs. Studios saw they could essentially run with skeleton crews. They could cut costs by laying off most of their workforce while simultaneously overworking the staff that remained. And it worked. In the span of 3 years, Hollywood managed to gut approximately 17% of its workforce. Writers, crew members, set designers, production assistants, animators, VFX artists. Many of these jobs were slashed not because they were no longer needed, but studios saw they could make more profit by hiring less of them. They were more than willing to disregard the livelihoods of those who make their money just to ensure that they, as a company, made more money. On the other hand, we saw the staff that did remain subjected to horrid conditions. The consumer demand didn't magically go away during lockdown. Studios still had to get their content pushed out, even if that meant overworking their employees. Even after COVID restrictions were lifted, studios still kept the strenuous conditions, such as extended working hours and tight deadlines. These conditions were already horrible due to the demand increase, but without adequate staffing, it made things even worse. You take a visual effects team of 200 employees and increase their workload from 3 projects a year to 6 projects a year. Now, slash their staff in half down to only 100 employees, without increasing their pay. You now have an overworked and underpaid staff that's forced to crank out twice as much work en masse while simultaneously being unable to pay their bills. And then everyone wonders why the dip in quality is so noticeable. You've worked your staff to death. During lockdown, animators essentially saved Hollywood's streaming services because it didn't require live action filming. But all the aforementioned issues hit the animation industry the hardest. An industry that was already overworked and underpaid saw Hollywood quickly adopting gig and contract-based jobs, as well as outsourcing to studios overseas. Anything that could cut costs and not require the studios to pay as much. By no longer having to pay the workforce that keeps the machine running, the executives were able to maximize profits as much as they could, stuffing their pockets by reaching into everyone else's. And this money never trickles down. It doesn't matter how instrumental your role is, unless you're an executive at the top or a shareholder, you're not seeing even a fraction of this money. While the Guardians of the Galaxy films were bringing in close to $1 billion each, creators of the characters have to create GoFundMes just to pay their medical bills. While box office numbers returned to pre-pandemic levels, employment rates within Hollywood remained low. And while the writers and actors were struggling to pay bills, CEOs and executives increased their yearly salaries. Residual pay is one of the many forms of income for actors and writers within the industry. Whenever a piece of media is reran, syndicated, or re-released, those involved receive a form of payment. This is performed through contracts with the labor union, and the amount of money received yearly from these residual checks varies, depending on the union and the contract. But for most writers and actors, it's not a very large sum of money. Streaming, however, allows for many of these corporations to not pay as much or avoid paying residuals at all. Many of them don't release their streaming data, nor any largely quantifiable information about viewership. Because of this, streaming services only had to issue the initial payment, and because there's no viewership data, there's little to no residual payment. It doesn't matter if a show is streamed 10 times or 10 million times. Luckily, due to the many organized strikes that took place last year, which we'll get into later on, the streaming services are required to pay a residual rate, but it's not the life-saving difference you'd imagine. The amount is still incredibly low. But amassing more wealth wasn't the only benefit for these companies. They were also able to establish almost complete control over distribution. Streaming allows for these companies to navigate around the need for movie theaters and other exhibitors. Everything could be centralized into one specific app. However, this is more of a benefit to the company rather than the consumer, as it gives the company sole digital ownership. The price, quality, and content of the media itself can be directly controlled. With everything being online, in the eyes of the company, there's no need for physical media. Blu-rays, discs, and other forms of physical ownership slowly start to get phased out in favor of corporate digital ownership. This ends up hurting the consumer more than anything else, as not only does it become harder to have ownership over the media you consume, but preserving it as well. With everything relegated to a digital app, it takes nothing for these companies to alter the content or delete it altogether, the latter of which is not as uncommon as you think. In the end, the studio gains complete control. Ownership and preservation of media is non-existent once corporate greed gets a hold of it. Art becomes lost as everything transforms into content. But as horrible as the current state of Hollywood may be, all of this was inevitable. Just like in our previous section, this is what happens when you take culturally significant elements and boil them down to just metrics and data. You completely end up disregarding said culture for the sole sake of profit. Entire subcultures, industries, and livelihoods get diluted or destroyed altogether just to make sure that a few executives can meet their profit margins. It doesn't matter how integral these careers may have been for the industry, or how their presence plays a role in preserving the legacy of cinema. In the end, they're just numbers, and numbers that become too expensive to keep the machine running get sent to the chopping block. Any way that the studios can save money, they will. The worst part about all of this is there's no way to stop it by conventional means. The machine is self-sustaining. This predicament took decades to get to this point. We're just now feeling the effects more than ever. The sad part is, by the time we all started paying attention, we were already in the terminal stage. Everything and everyone had already been overexploited in one way, shape, or form. Hollywood's greed had finally reached its breaking point. The foolproof system used for years was no longer working, as no one, workers nor consumers, could keep up with it. The bubble caused by the rush towards streaming was overinflated, and like any bubble, it's eventually gonna pop. In the end, the death of Hollywood is caused by none other than Hollywood itself, cannibalized by its own greed and exploitation. But when is it ever that simple? Hollywood as an industry in its current form may be dying, but it's still desperately clinging on to life support. The industry is going through an ugly transitionary period, making rapid changes in a desperate attempt to preserve the money and wealth that keeps it afloat. And just like a wounded animal, it will get rid of anything it deems unnecessary to its survival. But what now? Do we just sit back and let a few corporate entities continue to destroy decades worth of art and careers? How do we even begin to fight back against a system that's not only worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but is also 9 times out of 10 protected by the law? Here we are left on a sinking ship with no lifeboats. What am I supposed to do? I can't swim.
A runabout. I'll steal it! No one will ever know!
Oh boy, what a shit show. Luckily for me, I got my tickets buy one get one free. That's right, I'm giving the other one to you. We're going down on this shit show together. When it comes to topics like this, I'm hesitant to call any of these solutions, as it can be difficult to truly grasp the gravity of the situation. You have a multi-billion-dollar industry with unlimited financial, political, and legal resources compared to the workers and artists themselves who are just barely getting by. Many of them are having to watch the craft they've dedicated their entire lives to get washed away, and trying to condense any of that down into a single solution not only downplays the severity of what's really happening, but demonstrates a lack of understanding on what those involved can even do. Too often we tend to throw around buzzwords and phrases that we saw in a few tweets and treat them like a magic solution, which comes off as disingenuous more than anything. You may have noticed that I haven't really mentioned any of the major strikes that happened in Hollywood in 2023. For 4 months, writers and actors in Hollywood under the Writers Guild of America and SAG-AFTRA labor unions respectively went on strike over multiple labor disputes involving the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the main trade association the studio system operates through. The strike shut down countless productions in Hollywood, resulting in over 40,000 jobs cut and billions of dollars lost from the studios themselves. The wages, working hours, residuals earned from streaming, the protection of jobs from AI, all of these issues we spent the past half an hour discussing. The actors and writers were directly taking action against the corporations responsible. However, over a year later, nothing much has really changed. Workers are still underpaid, overexploited, and at risk of being replaced by AI. The labor unions reaching a deal may have delayed some of the negative effects for a while, but it did nothing to address the root causes. The studios and trade associations, for the most part, were able to use legal loopholes to still pay the bare minimum and continue on with business as usual. Any sort of real change within Hollywood is unrealistic. You're trying to change how the machine was designed to work, and that involves those up at top giving up too much money for that to happen. They would rather continue to cannibalize themselves and watch the industry implode before they pay the workers that keep the machine running a livable wage. This is one of the reasons why so many filmmakers and professionals have been leaving Hollywood, as it's just not sustainable anymore. Mainstream work is increasingly more difficult to get, and work that is available is quickly getting gutted. The current trend of low-effort blockbuster content is going to continue as long as it brings in money. Any real change coming from within the industry is impossible, as all those who could have been given a chance to push the boundaries of the art form are slowly being pushed out or unable to get in at all. Because of this, focus shouldn't be spent trying to quote-unquote fix or reform Hollywood from the inside, but instead supporting artists and independent ventures, and putting pressure on the companies that got us in this mess. First, there is support for artists and independent ventures, actually watching the content you want to see. Buried beneath all of the blockbusters are countless small filmmakers with stories to tell, from comedy to sci-fi, action, mystery, thriller, historical epics, rom-coms, any genre you can think of. They just don't have access to the industry and its tools. There are many smaller distributors and platforms out there that they use to get their content out. They don't make nearly as much money as one would in Hollywood and don't have the same level of reach. But they do exist and are the closest thing we have to creator-driven work as opposed to corporate slop. The industry may be shrinking, but it's no stranger to following wherever there's money. By supporting these smaller studios and projects, it shows Hollywood where and what to start throwing their money towards. It's how we get big game-changing television and cinema from writers and directors. They're given their shot on the silver screen by supporting them at their early stages. This isn't limited to live action, but animation as well. Whatever platform that may be on, that being streaming or a local showing, go watch it. When you're much more vocal about the content you actually want to see as opposed to the content you don't, the money is more likely to flow with it. This is in no way a replacement for Hollywood and does not have the same level of resources. But if the content becomes popular enough, the studios will begin to take notice and are more likely to pour more resources into the film, as it makes them money in return. We've seen this with independent production and distribution companies such as Neon, A24, and Magnolia, and even smaller distributors that can be found through streaming services like Tubi. Studios indirectly end up owning them and will pour money into wherever the buzz and hype is. However, that raises an issue. Once the studios get a hold of this fresh new idea, how long before they run it dry? Well, that's the problem. You don't know. You end up right back at square one. At the end of the day, the money still traces back to Hollywood. The final say on the big screen is always up to them. But what if you still want to support work from all the artists within Hollywood that are barely getting by and not getting paid by the studios, but not necessarily the studios themselves? You want to enjoy the content, but don't want to contribute to your favorite CEO's $10 million raise. Well, hypothetically, there's always ways to hypothetically stream what you want to see online for free. Hypothetically. As a disclaimer, I would never advocate for sailing the 7 seas at all. But if I did, I believe that media preservation is important. And with physical media slowly being phased out in some formats, it's important to seek alternative routes to ensure that it's preserved. Nobody knows a DVD man anymore, and that's the problem. We need a Blu-ray man. We're losing recipes. Anything that can be done to advocate for consumer ownership, I think you should pursue. In the end, Hollywood dies. It doesn't go out in a grandiose blaze of glory, but a slow, miserable burn. The result of decades of corporate greed, cannibalizing itself as it devalues everything based on metrics and data. But maybe it's time we tried something new. Maybe we don't need a Hollywood stamp of approval just to have a good time on screen. I'm dead serious about that live action Treasure Planet, by the way, like dead serious.